nice to see you all today. My name is Minh Nguyen, and we are in the gender dynamics training today. We're going to be going over quite a lot of content, but I hope that we'll have lots of opportunities for us to just chat and get to know each other throughout as we're going. So I am going to dive right in. This is part of the Agenda for Children training offerings. This has been offered almost every year for a while now, and all of you are fairly familiar with Agenda for Children, and I hope that you've been enjoying some of the trainings that you've been attending, and just getting to connect with each other through the communities of practice, the MSN, all these other offerings that the Agenda for Children has. So just a little bit more about me. My name is Minh Nguyen. I use she and they pronouns. I was part of the Cambridge community for a really long time. I was the director of programs at Tutoring Plus for 7 years, and I was in a middle school program for girls. We were talking about identity. I was asked to come in and talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, and I had a whole list of things ready to go, and I get in there and the middle school girls were like, I don't want to talk about that. And I was like, okay, that's fine, that's fine. So I sat in the corner, and then all of a sudden all these questions started coming out. Is it contagious? I heard this, I heard that. And all of a sudden I was in a conversation with some middle school girls about gender and sexual orientation. And what I found was just to have time and space to answer questions and to talk about it honestly and openly, because people have lots of questions and they don't fully know who to turn to, how to look it up, that sort of thing. I took it back to my coworkers, and they also had questions. So I started just developing these into a training, because I just noticed that folks needed time and space to learn through the concepts, through the questions, through the assumptions, lots of the things that we've been thinking about for a long time. And so my partner and I developed this organization, consulting, where we do LGBTQ trainings. Our organization is called KiriQ, which is a mix-up of the word Kyriarchy, which is a concentration of all the powers that enforce the isms in the world. So you can look that up. It's a fairly academic term, but what we want to do is interrupt it with questions. And so it's KiriQ. And so we've been doing these trainings for about 5 years now. And I still love doing them, especially for youth workers, just because I feel like it hits a little bit differently, and that we're able to have more deep conversations about gender. I am going to go over definitions just so that we're all kind of on the same page about it. Some of this might be review for folks, but I also ask you, if you are familiar with some of these things, kind of pay attention to how we're talking about it, how we might be able to teach it to young people, because all of the things that I'm trying to do in any training, I hope folks will steal and use with young people. And then we have a couple videos. We're going to talk about some of the challenges. And then I do have a section just a little bit about culture. I don't have enough time to go very deeply into it, but I do just kind of want to talk about that. And then I have best practices, which I hope will be very useful to some of you as we move forward. And then we have our survey and just a couple resources before we close out. So the goals of this training are, we're going to talk about gender. We're going to try and figure out what it is. We're going to try and figure out how culture informs gender, and then just have tools and strategies, like I said, in the best practices. I do want folks to be thinking about your own gender development, kind of like, where did you start to notice your gender? Where did you start to notice the messages that were around about your gender, things like that. We're going to go over definitions, and then also just to start to think about, how does gender show up in your programs with young people already? I know there's quite a couple things that we might not be consciously thinking about, but I hope that we can kind of uncover some of those as we move forward. So these are just a couple of the ways of being that I like to use in my LGBTQ trainings. The first one is just to ask questions and share knowledge. I know I have some knowledge, but there's plenty of a wealth of knowledge in the room too. So please jump in and help me out as I'm moving through these through the session, and also to share your personal experiences of either working with or being familiar with the community. I hope that you'll jump in and share. The next one is just assume best intentions, but also take responsibility for your impact. So this is also kind of related to permission to speak in the first draft, where sometimes we have questions and we don't know how to ask it. I'd rather folks just ask it and work through it so that we can get to what you're trying to learn. But at the same time, like sometimes we might say something that might be harmful. I just want folks to be able to take responsibility and recognize that you might be causing harm, even if you don't mean it. Sometimes that does happen. And then the last one is to not expect closure. This is a huge, huge topic. I have, about an hour and a half left to try and go through as much as possible. And that I hope that you're going to continue these conversations and you're learning. I'm still learning, and this is a process, right? We need to continue learning. And then the next one is just LGBTQ people are not a monolith. I am only one person who can speak to my experience. I try and bring in other voices, other stories, other perspectives, but just recognize that my story is not everybody's story. And then the last two I took from the Agenda for Children. I also want folks to take the lessons, but leave the details. Folks might be sharing fairly personal things about their lives. I don't want you to take their names and start telling other people about it. It's more about the learning and what did you take from the story. And then the last one is just to take care of yourself and the community, meaning if you need to take a break, you can turn your camera off and go and do what you need to. And if not, you can stay. And also just to recognize that every once in a while, sometimes we might recognize that somebody might need some help. We can check in with each other as we're moving forward through the training. I would like us to start to think about your gender development. I really want folks to be talking with each other about when did you first start recognizing that gender was a thing, that you were noticing it about yourself or about other people? Where did these messages come from? What are some of the things that you've been doing to try and fight against gender stereotypes? What's some things that are still hard to let go of? For example, for me, sometimes if I'm going into a completely new room, sometimes I'll look to certain people to be the leaders. And often those people are tall, they're often men, they're often, more of the loud types. And those are some of these stereotypes that I'm still trying to unpack, that person might not always be the one who's in charge all the time. But that's something that it's been ingrained into my kind of my brain, and so that's one thing that I'm still trying to fight against. And then just the last one is just, what questions do you have about gender? And folks can kind of just chat and talk. We are going to try and share back just a couple of big points in your breakout groups. That'd be great. Hello, welcome back. Would anybody like to share out what you kind of talked about, maybe some of the highlights of your conversations?
I'll go ahead because there was definitely some overlap between people in my breakout group. There was definitely a lot of influence of television, messaging from television that we got. I had a brother, so I noticed the treatment being different between me and my brother, but I also was constantly being bombarded by commercials and just the portrayal of people in the media. Like I was saying, I was given different toys, and I think a lot of times I didn't notice even that I was getting different toys because I happened to like the toys anyways. But then later on, I looked back and thought, why did my brother get to play with all the constructs and the Legos? And I probably would have really liked that, but I just was given dolls and told that I'm gonna be a mom someday, and I have to practice being a mom or something as a child, which is weird. But I noticed that other people were saying the thing about TV having a big influence on the messaging that they internalized.
Yeah, thank you.
I talked a little bit about clothing, about how when you're younger, and particularly a girl, they dress you up in skirts and dresses, but then you become a certain age and then it becomes over sexualized, and they don't want you wearing those things. I went to a Catholic school, so there was definitely fighting to wear pants for all my younghood. And then as soon as I got to a high school age, it was oh, well, now you're distracting in a skirt. And just now no one's allowed to wear skirts and you have to wear pants. So just that change in mindset from girls as children to girls as teenagers who are still children who are now being sexualized.
I was sharing that I always knew that I was a girl. I was just taught girly things. But I didn't realize the difference between real gender because my dad stayed home and my mom worked until about 8 years old when my aunt gave me a sticker that said a man is not a financial plan, and I was 8 years old, and really had to think about why, you know what I mean, and have that correlation of thought process. because like that wasn't the norm for me as a child. And so growing up and just like, yeah, understanding that part of gender, I think.
Wasn't what you were familiar with, but it was what somebody was telling you was the right way to do something, right? Great, thank you for sharing. So just hold on to some of those things because, you know, if we think about our young people, a lot of what they're getting are messages from the media, messages from family, messages from school. All those things kind of add up into not fully understanding gender before you understand it, you know? And so as we move forward, just keep that in mind. I'm going to jump into terms and definitions. How many folks are familiar with our friend, the gender unicorn? Have you ever seen this before? A couple of folks? Yeah, so for folks who are not familiar with it, this is a really fantastic tool that was developed by trans young people to talk about gender and sexual orientation. And it's not a perfect tool, I will put that out there, but I use it just because it's a very helpful starting conversation so that we can be on the same page about terms and definitions. I am going to go fairly quickly through them because we can spend a whole lot of time on it, but I don't feel like that's the best use of our time. And so I will go through it. If you have questions or if I'm talking too fast, please let me know. Just say, Min, you're going incredibly fast. Please slow down. That's more than okay. I am going to start with sex assigned at birth. So what's that one first question that people ask when somebody is pregnant? One of those first questions. Right.
Is it a boy or a girl?
Is it a boy or a girl? And we have these extravagant gender reveal parties, which are actually very damaging to many people in the environment. And actually the woman who created the idea of a gender reveal party actually came out more recently and said, I don't believe in this anymore. My own child actually was not the sex that we, was not the gender that we anticipated, right? And so when we're thinking about sex, it actually has everything to do with just biology. It has to do with your chromosomes, it has to do with your body, it has to do with your hormones, and how your body kind of presents itself and develops through puberty, right? So there are male and female dogs, there are male and female humans, there are male and female cats, and that's, you know, that's the what happens out in the world. Every once in a while, there are conditions where your chromosomes or your hormones might not match up. And so that's a condition called intersex, where sometimes folks may look and present one way on the outside, but on the inside, they actually have a different set of secondary sex characteristics. There's a really fantastic video on BuzzFeed called What It's Like to Be Intersex. I'm not going to be able to show it today, but if folks are interested to check it out, it's actually a really great way to detail the difference between being intersex and being trans. And unfortunately, I just don't have time to do it. But, you know, if we're thinking about it, there are intersex animals out there. I know that there was a recent case of a bird who was actually half colored female and half colored male, and that could be something that happens. But for humans, what happens is baby comes out and sometimes their body might look different. Their genitalia might be what they call ambiguous. And so families and doctors will make a decision to raise a child, and we're going to assign the sex to the child. Most often they do surgery on intersex children and they raise them female just because the surgery is easier. And they go, okay, well, you're just going to raise this child as a female the rest of their life. Many people don't know that they're intersex for a really long time until like puberty starts happening, and then some of the things are not developing normally according to the medical community. And the fun fact I like to throw out there is there are about as many intersex people in the world as there are people who have red hair. And so if you think about it, it's actually millions and millions and millions of people, but many of them actually don't know until something happens or, you know, medical complications arise. So that's sex assigned at birth. And so when we're talking about, you know, is it a boy or a girl, we're not actually saying that. We only know the genitalia of the child. And that's, you know, we're putting a lot of expectations onto a child before they're even out of the womb, right? That we're hoping they're going to grow up to be like this. We're hoping to buy these clothes. We're going to paint these rooms, these colors. And that's a lot of expectation for a child who doesn't actually have a choice in any of this yet, right? So gender has more to do with how you think of yourself and how we present ourselves, how we carry ourselves throughout the world, right? So dogs and cats don't have genders. I know we like to project, genders onto them. We like to put little pink bows onto female dogs, but they don't think of themselves as girls or women, right? To the way that humans do. And so for us, we have gender, we have meaning associated with what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl or a woman or man, right? I can use myself as an example. So I was assigned female at birth, and growing up, most people kind of assume that you're going to grow up to be a girl, grow up to be a woman, you're going to marry a man, live happily ever after, the end. But that's not the case for me, because as I was growing up, I felt physically uncomfortable anytime I had to think about putting on a dress or a skirt. And to even just think about it gave me like an intense anxiety, and I didn't know how to explain it for the longest time. I thought that I was just like a super tomboy because I didn't have the language to kind of explain what I was feeling. And what I was feeling is I'm actually more non-binary. I feel a little bit of both. I feel a little bit of a little bit of both and kind of a little bit of neither, right? So I'm just kind of myself. When I used to go out to schools, I would run into little ones. And if you've known me or met me in person, this is how I look. This is my hair. I wear little boys' clothes because that's what I fit into. That's what I like. I save a lot of money on clothes. That's okay. But they're always a little confused, and they always go, "Are you a boy or a girl?" Little ones are very bold, right? They will just ask you outright. I think if I go into a middle school, they're thinking it, they won't ask me. But I really welcome those moments where they're asking, are you a boy or a girl? Because I have an opportunity to say, well, what do you think I am? Let's have a conversation about it. Let's actually dig into what does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a girl? And what I do, I ask them a little bit, and then they will answer. They'll be like, oh, you look like a girl, but your hair is like this, or your clothes are like this. And I just have a conversation and I open it up for us to talk about it, because so often we don't have opportunities to actually talk about it. And then I explain to them, I'm a little bit of a boy, a little bit of a girl. Is that okay with you? The little ones are like, yeah, that's fine. And they just kind of run off and they're okay. Every once in a while, I'll get a little bit more pushback and they'll be like, well, you're wearing boys' clothes though. And I'm like, well, these are my clothes, so I'm wearing them. And so they don't have a gender. These are just my clothes, right? And so I welcome and challenge you to do this with young people, with middle school students, right? If they are having like conversations about gender, jump in and ask, where did you get that idea from? Where did you learn that from? Let's unpack this a little bit and just, have a conversation about it. I think that's a really great way to start these conversations. I think young people are thinking about them and they're already having these conversations with each other. And for us to jump in and be like, hey, I noticed this about us. Let's dig into it, right? And so my gender identity is non-binary. There are a couple other terms that folks may use. They use gender non-conforming is another common one, gender fluid, and there are a whole other bunch of other ones. I don't know if you can see it at the bottom. There's a great website called queerundefined.com, which is a whole database of people just coming onto a website and just entering your own definitions of lots of different terms, right? And so you're more than welcome to go in there and kind of learn a little bit. And that's a best practice that I want to share, is that many people will have different definitions for any number of identities. And what we can do is just ask, what does that mean for you, right? So if I say, I am bisexual, and other people will have other definitions, you can just ask, what does that mean for you? Because your definitions may differ. Non-binary is another big one. Another one that you may hear is queer, which I use to identify myself, just because it kind of tells people that I'm just not a straight cisgender person. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. It explains who I am. It explains my community. And for other people, queer as a term is actually offensive. And so if folks are using labels for themselves, you are welcome to use that same label for them. We don't want to use labels that they're not using for themselves, right? So if somebody says, I identify as bisexual, we're not going to jump in and be like, don't you mean this? Don't you actually mean something else, right? We're just going to kind of accept who and how they identify. And for some young people, they might be working through it. That's okay too, but whatever they're saying to you in the moment is how they feel, right? So gender identity and gender expression have a lot to do with some of the stereotypes that we already have about, masculinity, femininity, and things like that. Gender expression can be everything from your hairstyle, the clothes you pick, the friends you have, how you cross your legs. A lot of these things make up kind of your gender expression. And folks can kind of, I know, Bo, you brought up the idea of gender fluidity. Some folks, again, ask them, what does that mean for you? Would you like to explain that? If you have like a close relationship with them, right? And for some people, like one day they might feel a little bit more masculine, one day they might feel a little bit more feminine, some days they feel just like a mashup of all or both or neither, right? And so people can express themselves how they want to. There are lots of different ways to do this. Any questions so far about the difference between sex and gender? Yeah, and I've heard and have seen that many young people are starting to come out and they're starting to express themselves in any number of ways. I think that's really fantastic. And they are in some ways kind of leading these conversations about gender, and they know a lot, and they want to share, and they should be sharing with each other and with you as their youth workers, right?
Min, can I ask you a
Recently,
question? Oh, sorry.
Oh no. Recently, I heard someone say that they were expecting, and they weren't like, they didn't know the sex of their unborn child. And I just hadn't heard someone like specifically say like the sex of my child, even though like I like hate gender reveal parties, and it was just interesting that they were like saying it in that language, and how like we're nowhere close to like changing that idea of like, oh, this is what their gender will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's shifting a little bit, but we still have
Yeah.
quite a bit to go, because to many people this is new. I think it's new because we're starting to have the conversation. It's not new that this has existed forever. It's just new that we're able to actually feel safe to have these conversations and to have the language to start thinking about these things. Christina, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wonder is there a typical age that like, you don't have to answer your own personal story, but like that a child would be like, this doesn't feel like the right thing, or I don't feel like, is it usually childhood or puberty or,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually going to throw it out to the group. What do you all think? What is how early can young people understand their own gender identity? What do you think? How early that is?
I think it has a lot to do with the environment they're in and what language they have access to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I would say like kids can often say like what they're interested in, whether they can say like what their gender is. I mean, could be like as young as like toddlers. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some cases out there. Oh, so Susie, go ahead.
Different for each person.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on, the person, the individual, I would think.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Right. For myself, I didn't have opportunities, just like Talia said, I didn't have an environment where I was open to talk about these things. And I was raised Catholic and Vietnamese. And so we didn't even have the language. I still don't have the language to talk about my gender identity. Right. But there are a couple cases out there where as young as 2, that young people can start to recognize, because if you think about all the messages that they're being indoctrinated with, all the media out there, all the toys and clothes out there, and giving these messages of, are you a boy or are you a girl? And for some people, they are able to identify very early. So I don't know if many of you know Jazz Jennings. She was the youngest publicly trans person to come out on an interview with Barbara Walters. She was 6 when she had this interview, but as soon as she hit 2, as soon as she had the language to tell her family, I'm a girl, that's when it started happening. And so, I get a lot of pushback on it's too early to start talking about gender with young people, and that's not true, because even before they're out of the womb, we already have gender. We already have these conversations and ideas about who they're going to be, how they're going to be. Yeah, so 2 is the earliest, and for some people, right, again, context matters, history matters. There are many people who weren't able to fully be themselves until much later in their lives, and so there's a whole range of it. But for young children, sometimes it's as early as 2 that they fully recognize and know that this is who I am. The term that I've been throwing out, or the phrase I've been throwing out lately, is if children are insistent, consistent, and persistent about their identity, right? They're going to keep saying, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl. That's not going to change. It's not a phase, right? And it's consistent that they're, more drawn to certain things. and that they're also very persistent about it. And, you know, I will also put out there that that's not the case for everybody. Sometimes children are exploring and things like that, but there are some children out there who are absolutely sure. And so best practice, as you all as youth workers should know, is that we listen and we honor what young people are telling us. We're going to trust them. They know who they are, and we shouldn't try and convince them otherwise, you know. And sometimes it's just a matter of support, you know, like, that's really great. I'm going to support you however it is. That's okay if you change or shift, and that's okay if you don't, right? And I think that you already do this. I know you all already do this. And I think it's just a matter of feeling okay to, you know, just support and be okay with the fluctuations. Because again, we don't have to know everything about everybody to be able to be a kind, thoughtful, caring person, right? This goes for any number of other identities too. And so the last two are around sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is divided up into two different categories in this chart. And for the longest time growing up, I didn't think that that was a thing, because there are people who have emotional attractions to certain people and sexual attractions to certain other people. Sometimes it matches up, sometimes it doesn't, right? There may be people out there who identify as straight men and are still having sex with other men, but they still identify as straight, right? So like I said, we're just gonna honor the identity that's in front of us and not the behavior that we think is associated with the identities, right? And so that this can be really confusing, right? That sometimes people are confusing. They have identities and they act in ways that aren't consistent with what we think or know, right? But what we're gonna do is we're just gonna still honor who and how they want to identify. There are a number of reasons for, you know, for example, for straight men to not identify as gay or bisexual. Sometimes it's a safety thing. Sometimes it's a belonging thing. Sometimes it's just I'm uncomfortable with that idea. Sometimes it's internalized stuff that they're dealing with. There are a whole lot of different reasons for folks to identify in certain ways and behave in other ways, right? And so, you know, everybody in this room and anybody who's watching the recording later will have a different kind of category of how you do this, how your chart looks. And so if you ever have played a video game, sometimes you get to create your character, you get to be this tall or short, or your hair color is this shade or whatever, right? So in this chart, every person in this room probably has a different chart of how they identify on any of these spectrums in here. And just because we know one thing about somebody doesn't mean that we know anything about the other categories too, right? If you know my pronouns, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know anything about my sexual orientation or my gender identity. That's a conversation that you have with somebody that once you get a little closer to folks, right? I'm gonna move on. So these are just a couple more terms that have to do with the trans community specifically. So transgender is when the sex assigned at birth doesn't match up with your gender identity. I would consider myself transgender. If you are cisgender, that's the other side where you're not transgender. If your sex assigned at birth matches with your gender identity. So if you are assigned male at birth, you grow up to be a boy, grow up to be a man, you are a cisgender. And so the spoiler is, I think many of you are cisgender in this room, even if you've never heard this term before, okay? Transition. So for trans people, sometimes they choose to just do a social transition, which means I'm gonna change my name, I'm gonna change my pronouns. I hope everybody in my life will honor that and just respect my name and pronouns. That's a social transition for some people who are able to access medical care. Right, if they have access to being able to get some surgery, to get hormone treatment, that's a medical transition. Again, it depends on a whole lot of factors. I know there are many people of color, trans people of color are not able to access the medical care for a variety of systemic barriers out there, right? But that doesn't mean that makes them any less or more trans than somebody who doesn't, right? And so there is sometimes pushback in the trans community that sometimes they'll say, you don't have the surgeries, you're not trans. And that's actually very harmful and dangerous to people who can't or don't want to, right? To transition in that way. That's also just a very invasive question to ask. You're not going to ask a trans person, are you going to go get these treatments? Or are you going to go get the surgeries? It's, you know, you would never say that to somebody else about any other thing about surgery and things like that. Okay, and so with a social transition, a dead name is a name that you are given and you don't associate yourself with anymore. It's the same as pronouns that you don't associate yourself with, which is why we introduce pronouns, because sometimes it can be very mentally triggering for somebody to have to think about or deal with a name that they don't associate with themselves. So if your programs have a way that your records, your official records, may not match up with a, the social name that they choose, try and just honor the social name and pronouns of the young person, right? Official records are a thing that schools and systems and institutions are still dealing with. I was actually, somebody just told me that on Google Meet, you're not able to change your name or pronouns. And so for young people, that can be really damaging, right? That can be really harmful and uncomfortable for them. On Zoom, we have that option where we can change and we can do that. But there are lots of systems that are still working on it. And I can talk a little bit more about like what you can do as an organization to support that, especially with your registration forms, right? In the past, there were a lot of registration forms that would say circle 1 M or F. And the best practice now is actually just to leave a line. People can put whatever they want in there and you can have that conversation with the family or the child themselves, okay? And the pronouns, again, just because we know somebody's pronouns doesn't necessarily mean that we know who they are, how they identify, those other things. That comes with time. The pronouns is just as we want to learn people's names, we also want to honor their pronouns, okay? Any other definitions, terms that have come up that you're interested in, want to know a little bit more about while we're here?
I'm curious about aromantic because that's been coming up with a youth that I've worked with, and I had only heard about it recently.
Sure. Yeah, so somebody who is aromantic means that they're not interested in having romantic relationships with others, right? They might be still interested in having sexual relationships with some people, but they're not primarily concerned about having like a romantic connection with others. And again, this can be on a spectrum too. The ace community, sometimes it's asexual too. If you're asexual, meaning you're not interested in the sex part, but maybe you're interested in having romantic relationships with folks. And this can be, like some people can also identify as an aromantic lesbian, meaning maybe they're not interested in the romantic pieces of it, but maybe they're interested in sexual relationships with other women, for example, right? I can try and find websites on the ACE community because they're often very stigmatized and said that they're not normal because they're not interested in having sexual or romantic relationships with people. And that can feel really, really not great, right? That's not supportive to say, I don't believe you, that you're not interested in that, especially for young people or adults. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, that was actually really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and again, people will define it in any number of ways. Sometimes they are interested in certain aspects of certain sex, but not others, or certain aspects of romance, but not others. So I highly encourage you to go onto queerundefined.com to kind of get a snippet of what folks and how they define those things. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, and this again is just to use compassion. These are a couple flags. I'd like to kind of highlight them just because if we can recognize, or if you have time or space to put up a flag that can signal to young people or other people just in general that you're an ally to the community. I think that's very helpful. If I see a flag on a restaurant or a store, I'm like, I'm gonna go there instead of somewhere else, right? It's a big signal to people. The same thing with pronouns. If you're using pronouns in your Zoom name, in your email signature, sometimes to me that signals this person's kind of up on the language, up on the community, and is able to understand kind of a little bit more about who I am, right? So the top left is the gay flag. This middle one is the bi flag. This one on the upper right is the trans flag. This one on the bottom right is the pan flag, so pansexual. This one in the middle is the, it was developed by Philly Pride, and a means to honor and respect the Black and brown trans people who have done a lot for the gay community. It's more inclusive. It should honor those folks because they were some of the first people to fight for the rights, for my rights to be able to be here, to just have this conversation, right? And so often we erase Black and trans folks. And the one on the bottom left is actually the ACE flag, asexual. Okay.